Hey, what's going on, everybody? We're going into lesson 3 of natural selection. We're going to talk a little bit about artificial selection and kind of relate that to natural selection. It's different, but obviously there's some similarities there. We're going to kind of start with the first big concept here. If anybody kind of messes up the concepts or the theories of natural selection, it really starts at the foundation, which is natural variation. Okay. Darwin was doing all his travels, right? Traveling around the world. And he observed that there was natural variation among species. So there's variation between species, but there's also variation within a species. To give you a real basic example of that, if we're in class right now, we'd all stand up and we'd all be different heights, right? So there's variation in human height. Variation is key. Variation is good. Increased variation stems from meiosis, sexual reproduction, right? So meiosis, if you remember way back when, right, we had crossing over takes place, right? This random assortment of chromosomes, all that kind of leads to more variation. Not that you can't get variation in asexual reproduction, you can, mutations, things like that, but you can also have mutations and all this additional variation with meiosis, with gamete production, with sexual reproduction, because of crossing over, because of all that stuff. So variation is really built into species. It's a key thing. It's the key foundation to natural selection. So Darwin observed that there is a natural variation among species. He also believed that because more organisms were born than could possibly survive, the struggle for survival kept Earth from being overpopulated by plants and animals. What that means is, if you look at, frogs, for example, frogs will lay eggs. They can have up to 100 offspring. Well, not all 100 tadpoles, baby frogs, are going to survive to adulthood. There's going to be a lot of competition. There's a limitation of resources. There's a lot of competition, right? And the strongest ones will struggle to survive, will try to survive, right? But not all of them will. And that's why we don't become overpopulated by organisms. So natural selection is a process that allows for only the organisms with the best fitness to survive. So the ones that are the strongest, the most fit. And when I use the word strongest, it doesn't necessarily mean literally the strongest. It means best adapted for their environment. So in nature, the environmental conditions choose the adaptations that are most beneficial, so that only organisms with the best traits are reproducing. Okay. If I am some type of field mouse, a very, very good trait behaviorally might be to be very skittish, to be very attentive to the environment around me, to have good hearing. And the mice that have very good hearing, that are very attentive to the environment, very nervous in a sense, might be the most fit to survive compared to the ones that might be a little bit bolder, a little bit ones kind of venturing out of their habit, their house or their little den or their small little hole where they're living. They'll venture out more, might be more bold. Well, that might not be a good trait if you're a field mouse, right? A better trait might be a little bit more skittish and kind of hiding and avoiding predators. Okay, so it's not always the biggest and the strongest is the point I'm trying to get across. Okay, so before we go into natural selection, we'll talk a little bit about artificial selection. Artificial selection is simply natural selection, except nature's not choosing. There's this human interaction. So humans are artificially choosing the winners and losers, okay? So part of that artificial selection is also kind of being known as selective breeding. So if you think of the cattle production, right? Producing cattle. What cattle do we produce? Well, if we want to produce meat, we produce the cattle with the biggest muscles, the most meat, the ones that grow the fastest. If we want to produce cattle that produce the most milk, we don't produce the ones with the most muscle. We breed the ones that have the most milk production. We select what traits we want. So Darwin noticed that when farmers and breeders choose which animals or plants to mate, they are relying on the fact that there are different traits in the population. Some cattle are better for meat producers, some are better for milk producers. Not two individuals are exactly alike, and variation is heritable, which means it can be passed down from generation to generation. With artificial selection, right, farmers choose the best characteristics. Nature provided variation, humans control the breeding, right? So the natural variations of cattle with their different amount of muscle mass or muscle size allowed humans to choose, okay, which ones do we want? We want the one with the largest muscles. They would breed those together to produce the cattle with the largest muscles, the largest meat production. or milk, whatever you want, whatever trait you want to look at. So it's called artificial selection. It has resulted in a wide range of plants and animals that are very different from their ancestors. One good example of this, I mean, there's examples everywhere, but you could think of cattle, you could think of horses for horse racing, right? The thoroughbreds are not natural horses, right? They've been selectively bred year after year to be the fastest horses that are out there. You can think of all the different dog breeds that are out there. We're all descended from wolves, right? And we've selected for different dog breeds. Do you want a big dog to go hunting fox with? You're going to produce some type of hound. If you want a small dog to go hunt, let's say smaller rabbits or something like that can burrow in the holes, you might want a small dog like a little terrier or something that could actually get into holes, right? Depends on what you want for your dog. Another great example of this artificial selection, really all of our produce have been produced artificially, artificial selection, but corn, the modern corn that we know, came from this ancestral grain known as teosynth. This looks a lot like wheat. You think of like fields of wheat kind of blowing back and forth and that little kind of wheat production at the top, right? Well, what they did is teosynth was around about 10,000 years ago, and ancestors started to breed for the largest kernels, right? So here's kind of the natural teosynth, right? But what they do is every generation, they choose the one that had the larger kernels. And generation after generation after generation, the kernels became larger and larger and juicier, more flavor to it. So with that, right, this teosynth turned into the modern corn that we know today. It took about 10,000 years to get there, but we got there, right? And it shows the power of artificial selection, of selective breeding. So in nature, though, taking it from artificial selection to natural selection, it's the exact same process, except we're not choosing what traits are the traits that we want, which traits we want to come through the next generation. Nature is, right? And nature is simply choosing for, if I have two rabbits, one's a very, very bright white, the other one is a little bit of an off grayish color, and those rabbits happen to live in the Arctic. The one that's bright white is probably the one that's going to survive because it can blend into the environment a little bit more, right? So those variations happen naturally, and then the environment selects which one are most fit. So inheritable variation exists in nature as well, because each organism is slightly different. Each has slightly different advantages and disadvantages. Some individuals might be more fit than others, better suited to survive and reproduce, or survival of the fittest. You take the example of the two rabbits, the one that has the real bright white color and the one has the grayish color. If you go through a number of years and you live in the southern Arctic, we go through a number of years of warming and there's not as much snow or not as much ice cover, you're getting more rock kind of color. The gray color might be favored in those years, right? So it's not always the same trait that's favored all the time. It depends on the environment, and environments change. So selection in nature, generation after generation, the struggle for existence selects the fittest individuals to survive and reproduce. Species in general become better suited for their environments as they respond to selection pressures. And the selection pressure is just the selection process, right? If you are in the Arctic, the selection pressure is to be colored white because you blend in more. So therefore the white rabbits are selected for, the darker colored rabbits are selected against because they don't blend into the environment as much. That's a selection pressure. Another classic example of this are giraffes. So we all know like giraffes, the ancestors of the giraffes, their necks weren't quite as long. And over time, their necks have become longer. They live in the savanna, so there's not a ton of vegetation down low, so the giraffes kind of tend to adapt to try to eat the leaves out of trees. Well, way back when, right, the giraffes' necks were much shorter. However, this is where we'd start from. There's variation in the population. So even though all the giraffes had shorter necks, they didn't have all the same size necks. They had different sizes of short necks. Just like if we were all standing up in class right now, we'd all be different heights. So with that, there was variation, natural variation in the giraffe population. Now, in terms of a food source, right, which giraffes were more likely to survive and reproduce? Well, the ones with slightly longer necks had an easier time reaching leaves, were able to feed more, they became stronger, they became better competitors, and they tend to survive and to reproduce more often. If the ones with slightly longer necks survive and reproduce more often in the next generation, what happens to the average neck size? There's more genes, alleles for longer necks in the next generation. So therefore, the giraffe's necks are going to get a little bit longer, right? And then the next generation, the same pressures happen to get a little bit longer. And over hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years, over hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of generations, right, the giraffe's necks can slowly get longer and longer and longer and longer. So where does this variation come from? We've already kind of mentioned this, right? So variation in traits are variations in phenotypes, right? So phenotypes are physical characteristics, and traits are controlled by our genes, by our genotypes, right? And the different forms of a genes are called, hopefully you're saying alleles right now, are called alleles, right? Humans, we have all the same genes. However, we all have different forms of those genes, different alleles for those genes, right? And heritable variation comes from the differences in genes, genetic diversity, which is your allele makeup. Where do these differences come from? Well, they can come from mutations, right? New alleles, new traits can arise from mutations, which are random processes. But we also do gene shuffling, which doesn't introduce new traits. What it does, remember, kind of shuffling the deck, right? If you were to deal cards out the same way every time and put them back in order and deal it, everybody get the same hand every time. But what do we do before we deal? We shuffle the deck. And that's what meiosis does. It shuffles where all the chromosomes go, crossing over takes place. So therefore, every time gametes are formed, every time the next generation is formed, we get different combinations of the existing alleles, which increases variation. Sorry, went too fast. So mutations and variations. Mutation rates vary by species. All that's saying is, some species have high rates of mutations, some species have low rates of mutation. Bacteria happen to have high rates, humans tend to have low rates. Mutations can be positive, negative, or no effect whatsoever is the third category. So many can have positive effects, many can have negative effects. If I have a mutation that prevents an enzyme that's needed for digestion, that enzyme is mutated, it's not working, you're not going to be able to digest your food. Therefore, that's going to have a negative effect. If I have a mutation that causes the formation of a new enzyme that makes you more efficient at digesting your food, that's going to have a positive effect. So mutations can go either way. Gene shuffling variation, so sexual reproduction is meiosis, and it's an important source of variation in nature. Genes are shuffled during meiosis when gametes are formed. Even the same genes combine in different ways to produce different results. Now, that concept is what we were just talking about, right? Mutations can give us new alleles in our population. Gene shuffling, right, meiosis, crossing over, doesn't give us new alleles. It just shuffles the deck, and that's what that's saying. It gives us more combinations. And the last thing is principles of natural selection. So really, here's like the summary slide of everything. Individuals in a population show variations among others of the same species, right? There's variation in our species. Variations are inherited from their parents. Animals have more young than can survive on available resources. All that's saying is, like with our frogs, right? They produce a whole bunch of tadpoles. Not all the tadpoles are going to survive, but which ones are going to survive? The ones that have the right variations, combinations that make them the most fit to survive and reproduce on their own. And that's really the summary of natural selection. So again, individuals in a population, we have variations in our species. Those variations are inherited from our parents, or we pass them on to the next generation. Organisms always have more offspring than the environment can support, right? That's what causes the competition. And that competition drives the selection of organisms that have the best fitness, the best adaptations. Couple quick notes here. Variation occurs at all levels, right? So it can be physical, so like physical characteristics you see, biochemical, like we talk about digestion, like a small little enzyme that can make you more or less efficient at digestion. Behavioral as well, right? We've talked about like the little field mouse that is very skittish. And especially with humans, many of our traits are polygenic. So, right, it adds even more complexity, even more variation, because most of our traits aren't dictated by a gene. Most of our traits are polygenic, which means they're dictated by many different genes. So many different genes. So if you terms of like human height, I can't put human height into two categories, right? We're all different heights. Why are we all different heights? Because there's about 6 or 7 different genes that dictate human height. Hence, we have a lot of variation in that phenotype. One big thing is natural selection does not act on genotype. Nature, the environment, doesn't know your genetic makeup. It just knows your physical characteristics. It affects your genetic makeup or the genetic makeup of the next generation, what's going to be passed down by who survives and who doesn't survive. But natural selection really only affects phenotypes, right? The giraffes, the environment didn't care what the genetic makeup for the giraffes were. The environment only cared that the giraffes with longer necks were able to eat more, become stronger, and were able to survive and reproduce. So therefore, they put their alleles into the next generation. The genotype had nothing to do with the selection process. It was the phenotype that was selected for. And that's it. That is lesson 3 on natural selection. We'll talk in class, and if you have any questions, we'll answer it then. Thank you very much.